Welcome back to Called to Community. We're on chapter 45 of this lovely book. It's called Comfort Zones. But before we get into the chapter, Doreen, there was a comment that I promised the commenter I would respond to. It's from Greg Bourne. Greg, if you're watching, thanks for this question. He writes, I am a professed Catholic brother. Our vocation is to serve the poor in the Chicago and Milwaukee areas. We spend our days serving the homeless and also ministering to the prison population. We take vows of poverty. While I only receive a stipend of $70 a month, the community as a whole is quite wealthy. We live an upper middle class lifestyle. We live in a nice suburb and drive to Chicago to serve the poor. This has been difficult for me to accept as I feel we should be living amongst the poor. It seems almost hypocritical and I'm struggling with it. I wonder if you might speak to this more fully in a future video. Then he says that he has visited one of our communities in Pennsylvania, or we have two communities. So this is a great question, and it's one we periodically will wrestle with here in the Bruderhof. Different members will have this concern, and it's good to think about it. It's good to take Jesus' admonitions about wealth seriously.
But when you've made vows and commit to each other in Christian community, that also forces you to not just come to a personal decision on how that looks for you as an individual, but first and foremost, your commitment is to your brothers and sisters, or in his case, brothers, and then, ultimately that leads to the blessing of the commitment to God. So I think that plays into the response here. What would you think?
Yeah. No, I think for those of us who are in these, in Greg's case, a monastic order, Catholic monastic order, for us in an Anabaptist community of goods, the vows we've taken, and I think the words we use are, do you bind yourself wholly and unreservedly to this body of believers? That kind of takes these decisions, these further decisions about where we should live and how we should minister off the table. We're committed to life together in Christian discipleship. As a community, absolutely, we should strive to live simply and frugally and in order to serve the poor. But in terms of where we live, that's not really my choice anymore. If the community decides to send me to live in a poor area or inner city area, whatever, I would obediently do that.
Yeah, and I think that first and foremost is our attitude of love to each other and honoring that commitment that then gives a blessing or enables us to then go out and be the hands and feet of Christ for others. So, that's something that always brings me peace when this question comes up, is like, how do I love my neighbor as myself?
Right.
That commandment is extremely challenging and takes a lot of work.
Someone pointed out somewhere that this command to love your neighbor is not like a theoretical love. It's neighbor is the person next to you, and that could be an extremely wealthy person, or it could be someone in material want. So anyway, great question, Greg. Thanks for bringing that up. Always worth, even if we go over the same questions many times, it's worth talking about them again.
It's necessary.
So on to chapter 45, Comfort Zones, which starts out with a pretty strong Jeremiad by Eugene H. Peterson against sectarianism, where he decries the Christian tendency toward breaking up into smaller and smaller groups where we just associate with like-minded people and have contempt for people of different faith convictions. Any thoughts on this one, Doreen?
Yes, this one was very thought-provoking, I thought, because comfort zones is something as humans we just naturally gravitate towards situations or scenarios where we feel more comfortable, and that happens in community as well. So he talks about how the roots of sectarianism is selfism, putting yourself first, and I think selfishness is pretty much the root of all evil, and that's kind of where things start devolving into just not living to your full capacity. So I don't know, I think that we have to take a fierce stand against selfishness and selfism, but it doesn't have to be overcomplicated. I think that it's just a matter of going back to the gospel and taking those commandments of Christ seriously, and all the stories that he tells about being the salt of the earth and the light, and all those allegories and the different parables, and trying to see how that applies to ourselves. And I think that, if we really honor that and also try to live a life of love where we actually are trying to do that every day, this danger kind of lessens and doesn't have as great a hold, or is not something we have to be too concerned about. So it is a challenge, but I think it can be pretty simply addressed.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I guess the one question I had coming out of the first section by Eugene H. Peterson is how to reconcile sort of the universal implications or vision of God's kingdom with the gospel demands, which require us to take up our cross and follow Jesus. And they're not popular demands. They're not widely embraced demands where we're asked to deny ourselves. And Jesus speaks about the narrow way, right?
He does.
Which few find, and the wide way to destruction. So I wouldn't say necessarily that people's faith commitments, which tend to leave other people out, are necessarily selfish. It's people trying to be obedient to what they see as Jesus' teachings, and that is gonna, by default, exclude a lot of people. This doesn't mean we condemn people to hell or say, but it's a personal faith conviction that is necessarily going to, be otherworldly, right? We're in the world, not of the world. So I think it would be a mistake to try to be all embracing, all inclusive at the expense of obedience to Jesus' teachings.
Yes, and also, as Elton Trueblood points out in the excerpt from him, that is why we call it a redemptive society. And I think that kind of also addresses or goes to what you were saying, how, as a body of believers that are committed to each other, if we're seeking redemption, then the fruits will show. And there's no selfism in that, but there is, I think selfism is different than personalism, because each of us are given value by God and Christ, and that can't be negated. We're not just nobodies pointlessly doing nothing on earth. We're actually being ambassadors for the kingdom. And so I don't think we should conflate those two ideas. It's not completely putting humans and out of the picture. It's what gives us worth, and then trying to get back to living in that frame of redemption together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so. And witnessing to that redemption to other people. I think Elton Trueblood in the second section says, the church is not for itself, but for the world around it. And we always need to be engaged in finding new ways to transcend. The church needs to seek ways to transcend itself. So that's really important insight, that we, as a body of believers, as a community called together, our responsibility is to the world around us, and we need to pray that our life together has an effect, that it points to God's kingdom, and is part of that reconciling vision that we read about. So, great chapter. Again, any questions, comments? Would love to hear them. Thanks so much.